November 6, 2025. Cascade Valley, California, 1743 hours. A man died in the California desert tonight. Not this man, not yet, but someone would die before sunrise. Thomas Grant knew it the way he knew his own name, the way he knew the weight of every rifle he had ever carried across 6 continents in 4 decades of service to a country that had mostly forgotten men like him existed. The way he knew that 65 years of living had brought him to this ridge, this moment, this reckoning with a past he thought he had buried in a jungle clearing 30 years ago when he put 6 bullets into a man who refused to stay dead. The fence post could wait. It had been waiting for 3 weeks already, leaning at an angle that would have driven his father crazy. The old man had been particular about fence posts, said a crooked fence told the world you did not care about details, and a man who did not care about details was a man who would fail when details mattered most. Thomas had heard that lecture 100 times growing up on this ranch, delivered in his father's gruff voice that carried the permanent rasp of too many unfiltered camels and too much Jim Beam, consumed in the years after Vietnam, when the nightmares came every night and sleep was something other people enjoyed. William Grant had served 2 tours in Vietnam, had come home with a Bronze Star and a Silver Star and a 1,000-yard stare that never fully went away. Had built this fence with his own hands in 1968, the year he finally accepted that he needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere he could see the horizon in every direction, somewhere nobody could sneak up on him while he slept, somewhere the demons that followed him home from the Mekong Delta might lose his trail. The fence had outlasted William Grant by 36 years, had outlasted Thomas's mother by 22, had outlasted Rachel by 5. The wood was weathered now, gray and cracked from decades of desert sun, but the posts still stood straight because Thomas maintained them the way his father had taught him, the way his father had maintained everything, with precision, with care, with the understanding that things built properly lasted and things neglected fell apart. One more night would not matter for the fence. Death would not wait. Death never waited for anyone. Thomas had learned that lesson early, had learned it the first time he saw a man die in combat, a young private named Rodriguez, who took a round through the throat in Grenada in 1983 and spent his last 30 seconds on Earth drowning in his own blood while Thomas held his hand and lied about how everything would be okay. Death had been Thomas's constant companion ever since, had followed him through Panama and Somalia and Iraq and Afghanistan and a dozen other places that existed only in classified files and the memories of men who had been there. Death was patient in its own way, content to wait in the shadows until the moment was right. But when death decided to move, it moved fast. You either moved faster or you joined the ranks of those who had not. Tonight, death was moving somewhere in the darkness beyond the valley. Thomas could feel it the way old wounds felt approaching storms, could sense it in the wrongness of the evening air, could hear it in the silence that had fallen over the desert like a shroud. He set down the hammer, the wooden handle worn smooth by 3 generations of Grant hands, and listened. November wind carried sounds across the valley like whispers from a world that existed just beyond the edge of perception. Coyotes had been calling to each other earlier, their voices rising and falling in ancient songs that had echoed through these canyons long before humans built their fences and roads and cities. But the coyotes had gone silent now, had stopped mid-song as if someone had flipped a switch, as if something had moved through their territory that frightened them into stillness. Coyotes were not easily frightened. They were survivors, adapters, creatures that had learned to thrive alongside humans by being smart and careful and knowing when to hide. If the coyotes had gone silent, something had spooked them, something dangerous, something that did not belong in the natural order of predator and prey. Distant traffic on Interstate 8 provided a constant backdrop of engine noise, 18-wheelers hauling goods between San Diego and Phoenix on a highway that never slept. The drivers sat in air-conditioned cabs, listening to satellite radio and podcasts and audiobooks, completely unaware of the violence brewing in the hills they passed, completely unaware that men with guns were preparing to kill each other 15 miles from the highway rest stop where they bought coffee and beef jerky and used restrooms that smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation. The world went on, oblivious to the small wars fought in its shadows. Thomas had spent his life fighting those shadow wars, had spent 40 years ensuring that truck drivers could haul their goods and families could take road trips and ordinary people could live ordinary lives without knowing the price paid for their safety. That was what service meant. Not glory or recognition or gratitude, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that your sacrifices made other people's lives possible. The steady hum of insects provided another layer of sound. Crickets and cicadas performing their final concerts before winter silenced them. But even the insects seemed subdued tonight. Their songs were quieter than usual, more hesitant, as if they too sensed something wrong in the air. The creak of the old windmill near the barn was the only sound that remained unchanged. His grandfather had installed it in 1947, when this ranch was nothing but dust and dreams and the stubborn determination of a man who had survived the Pacific Theater and refused to be defeated by anything as mundane as a California desert. William Grant Sr. had fought across islands whose names most Americans had forgotten. Tarawa and Saipan and Iwo Jima, had watched friends die in ways that would haunt him until his own death in 1961 from a heart attack that the family always suspected was really a broken heart that had finally given out. 3 generations of Grants had listened to that windmill turning. 3 generations had drawn water from the same well. 3 generations had worked this land and bled for it and been buried in the family plot on the hill overlooking the valley where the sunset painted everything gold and orange in the final hour of daylight. Thomas would be buried there too someday, next to Rachel, next to his parents, next to the grandparents whose photographs hung on the walls inside the house. Faded images of people he barely remembered, but whose blood ran through his veins and whose legacy shaped everything he had become. But underneath all those familiar sounds was something else tonight. Something wrong. Something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up the way it had in 100 combat zones across 4 decades of service. The silence that came before violence. Not absence of sound, something more subtle and more dangerous. The absence of certain sounds. The way the coyotes had stopped singing. The way the birds had stopped calling from the scrub brush near the wash. The way even the insects had paused their eternal chorus, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Prey animals knew when predators were moving. They felt it in ways that humans had forgotten how to feel. Their survival instincts dulled by thousands of years of civilization and the false security of walls and weapons, and the belief that someone else would protect them from danger. Modern humans walk through the world believing they were safe because they had created systems and structures that should protect them. They had forgotten that protection was illusion, that safety was temporary, that violence was always waiting just outside the light, patient and hungry and eternally ready. But Thomas had spent 40 years relearning those ancient instincts, had spent decades in places where the difference between hearing danger and missing it was the difference between going home in a seat or going home in a box, had trained himself to notice the subtle shifts in environment that preceded attacks, the way animals went quiet, the way shadows seemed to deepen, the way the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. He heard it now, felt it in his bones the way his rebuilt shoulder felt approaching storms, the titanium and surgical steel that held his joint together acting like a barometer for changes in atmospheric pressure. Something was moving in the darkness beyond the valley. Men with guns and bad intentions. Blood would spill before the sun rose again. The only question was whose blood and how much. The radio on his truck crackled with traffic from the Border Patrol frequency, a frequency he was not supposed to be able to receive. But Rangers took care of their own, and debts incurred in combat were paid in whatever currency was available. Danny Park had been a 23-year-old communications specialist when Thomas pulled him out of an ambush in Ramadi in 2005. The kid had taken shrapnel in both legs when the IED detonated, was bleeding out in the street while insurgent fighters closed in for the kill. Thomas had carried him 300 meters to the extraction point through a hail of gunfire, had applied tourniquets while returning fire with his sidearm, had kept Danny alive through sheer stubborn refusal to let another soldier die on his watch. Danny walked with a limp now, worked a desk job at the NSA doing things he could never talk about, had a wife named Sarah and 2 kids named Michael and Emma who would never know how close their father came to dying in a dusty street 6,000 miles from home. The scanner was his retirement gift to Thomas, delivered personally with a bottle of 20-year-old scotch and a handshake that said more than words ever could. Said it was the least he could do. Said no amount of electronics could repay what Thomas had done. Thomas had told him the debt was paid in full the moment Danny made it home to his family. That was what the work was for. That was why they did what they did, so that young men could grow old, so that children could have fathers, so that we did not have to become widows. The scanner kept Thomas connected to what was happening along the border, kept him informed about the violence that crept closer to his valley every month, like a cancer spreading through healthy tissue. The cartels had been growing bolder for years, pushing further north, establishing operations in areas that used to be safe. The border was a war zone now, even if the politicians refused to call it that. The dispatcher's voice came through flat and professional, the controlled tone of someone who dealt with death and chaos every day and had learned to keep emotion out of her voice because emotion got in the way of doing the job. Shots fired near Tecate. Cartel ambush on a border patrol unit conducting routine patrol operations along the secondary fence line. 3 agents down with gunshot wounds, injuries ranging from moderate to critical. 1 agent with arterial bleeding from what sounded like a femoral hit. The femoral artery was the worst. You had maybe 2 minutes before you had bled out, maybe 3 if you were lucky and the wound was not too severe. Medevac requested ETA 40 minutes to the trauma center in San Diego. 40 minutes was too long. Everyone listening to that frequency knew it. The dispatcher knew it. The agents on the ground knew it. The man with the femoral bleed probably knew it too, if he was still conscious. He was going to die in the dirt 15 miles from where Thomas stood, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Somewhere, a wife was about to receive the worst phone call of her life. Somewhere, children were about to learn that their father was never coming home. Somewhere, a family was about to be destroyed by violence that most Americans would never hear about. That would be a 30-second story on the local news before being forgotten in the endless churn of information that passed for modern life. Thomas had made notifications like that, had knocked on doors in dress uniform with a chaplain beside him, had watched worlds collapse in real motion as wives and mothers realized why 2 soldiers were standing on their porch, had delivered the words that transformed wives into widows and children into half-orphans and parents into people who had outlived their children. It never got easier. Anyone who said it got easier was lying or had never done it. The faces stayed with you, the sounds stayed with you, the way grief smelled, like tears and stale coffee, and the particular staleness of houses where no one had opened windows in days because the occupants were too devastated to care about fresh air. Thomas turned the volume up and listened to the chaos unfold in real time. Units responding from multiple positions, racing toward the ambush site with lights and sirens. Helicopters spinning up at the field office in El Centro, rotors beginning their acceleration toward flight speed. Tactical teams mobilizing from the station in Campo, loading gear and checking weapons, and running through the mental preparation that came before every potential firefight. The measured chaos of professionals responding to crisis. Each person doing their job. Each person trusting that everyone else would do theirs. The system functioning the way it was designed to function. But Thomas heard what the dispatcher did not say. What the agents in the field could not articulate because they were too busy fighting for their lives, too focused on immediate survival to analyze the broader tactical picture. The ambush was too clean, too professional, too well coordinated to be the work of ordinary cartel soldiers who had learned to fight through trial and error in the brutal Darwinian selection of criminal violence. Initial reports described interlocking fields of fire, multiple positions covering each other so that anyone who escaped one kill zone walked directly into another. Prepared positions with clear sight lines, firing points that had been selected hours or days in advance by someone who understood terrain analysis and dead space in the geometry of death. Coordinated withdrawal routes that let the attackers fade into the desert before response teams could arrive, disappearing like ghosts into the night. Military precision, textbook execution. The kind of operational planning that took training and discipline and experience that you did not acquire by running drugs and murdering rivals. Cartels had not demonstrated this level of tactical sophistication 6 months ago. A year ago, they had been dangerous but sloppy, relying on numbers and firepower, and the willingness to absorb casualties. They had fought like criminals, not soldiers. Now they were executing coordinated ambushes with overlapping sectors of fire and prepared escape routes, and the kind of discipline that only came from professional military training. Someone was teaching them techniques that only came from American special operations schools. The same schools where Thomas had taught for 5 years after his injuries ended his field career. Fort Benning, the Ranger School where he had helped shape a generation of elite soldiers. The tactics and techniques and procedures that he had helped codify in the manuals that trained America's most dangerous warriors, teaching them how to predict American movements, how to analyze patrol patterns and identify vulnerabilities in schedules and routes, how to set up ambushes that maximize casualties and minimize risk, how to use terrain to create kill zones that were nearly inescapable, how to kill Americans with American methods. The betrayal was personal even before Thomas knew who was behind it. Someone had taken the knowledge he helped create and weaponized it against the very people it was designed to protect. Someone had crossed a line that should never be crossed, had become the enemy instead of fighting the enemy, had chosen money or ideology or simple malice over the oaths they had sworn. Thomas intended to find out who, and then he intended to do something about it. His daughter would know more. Jordan, 28 years old, strong and capable and fierce in ways that reminded Thomas of her mother every single day. Working night shift at Betty's Diner 3 days a week, slinging hash and pouring coffee for truckers and tourists who had no idea they were being served by one of the most dangerous people in the American Southwest. Betty Martinez had owned that diner for 30 years, had seen waitresses come and go, had learned to spot the good ones and the flaky ones and the ones who were just passing through on their way to somewhere else. Betty thought Jordan was a godsend, a reliable worker who never complained about the late hours or the difficult customers or the truckers who thought a smile was an invitation for something more. Betty did not know about the other 4 nights. The nights when Jordan did not come to the diner. The nights when she left the house after dark in clothes that were not waitress clothes, driving a vehicle that was registered to a company that existed only on paper. The nights when she disappeared into the desert carrying equipment that waitresses did not carry and came home at dawn with desert dust on her boots and the smell of gunpowder in her hair. She always had explanations for the evidence she could not hide. The dust came from hiking the canyon trails east of the valley. The bruises on her arms came from climbing rocks and scrambling through brush. The exhaustion came from pushing herself too hard, from not getting enough sleep, from working too many hours at the diner. The explanations might have satisfied someone who did not know what combat looked like, who did not know what powder residue smelled like clinging to hair and clothes even after showering, who did not recognize the 1,000-yard stare that came from spending hours in a state of hypervigilance, watching for threats, calculating angles, making decisions that meant life or death for people you would never meet. Thomas knew what all of those things looked like, had lived with all of them for 40 years, had carried the weight of them home from every deployment and tried to set them down and never quite succeeded. He had not asked Jordan what she was doing, did not need to ask. The evidence was obvious to anyone who knew how to read it. His daughter was operating, had been operating for at least 2 years, had become something the Army said women could not become, something dangerous and capable and lethal. Tonight, they would stop pretending. Tonight, he would ask the questions he had been avoiding, would have the conversation that needed to happen before federal agents started asking their own questions, before his daughter's luck ran out, before whatever she was doing brought consequences down on the only family either of them had left. The sun dropped below the western ridge. The sky exploded into color, oranges and purples and reds bleeding into each other like watercolors left out in the rain. Rachel used to paint these sunsets, would sit on the porch with her easel and her brushes and try to capture colors that seemed to exist only in that moment, that faded as soon as the sun disappeared and could never quite be recreated from memory. She had been good, had sold paintings at craft fairs and local galleries, had dreamed of someday having a real show in a real gallery in a city where people paid real money for art. Cancer had taken that dream along with everything else. 5 years gone now. 5 years since Thomas had held her hand in the hospice room and watched her take her last breath. 5 years since he had buried her on the hill next to his parents and her parents and all the other Grants who had loved this valley and been loved by it. He still slept on his side of the bed, still kept her reading glasses on the nightstand, still talked to her sometimes when the nights got long and the quiet pressed in from all sides, told her about the ranch, about Jordan, about the world that kept turning even though she was no longer in it. She would have known what to do about Jordan, would have seen the signs earlier, would have had the conversation Thomas kept avoiding because talking about it meant acknowledging what his daughter had become. Temperature fell 20 degrees in 20 minutes. Desert nights were brutal that way. The same sand that burned your feet at noon would freeze you solid by midnight if you were not prepared. Thomas had seen men die from exposure in deserts, had seen hypothermia take soldiers who made the mistake of thinking sand meant heat. He walked toward the house. His back complained with every step, the compressed vertebrae grinding against each other like stones in a mill. The injury dated back to Somalia, to the helicopter crash that should have killed him, to the 6 months of rehabilitation that followed when doctors told him he would never walk normally again. He had proved them wrong, had pushed through pain that would have broken most people, had forced his body to heal through sheer stubborn refusal to accept limitation. But the damage remained, would always remain. Some injuries never fully healed no matter how hard you worked or how much you wanted them to. His knees complained too, the titanium replacement in his left leg clicking with every stride. Fallujah had taken the original knee, an IED that detonated too early and caught his vehicle instead of its intended target. 2 men had died in that blast. Thomas had lost 6 inches of bone and gained a lifetime of pain and a purple heart that sat in a drawer with all the other medals he never looked at. The shoulder joined the chorus of complaints, the joint that had been rebuilt after a repelling accident at Fort Bragg. 4 surgeries to get it functional again. Months of physical therapy, a lifetime of limited range of motion, and a reliable ability to predict weather changes based on how much the surgical steel ached. 65 years showed in every step, in the hitch in his stride, in the way he moved more slowly than he used to move, in the careful way he navigated uneven ground that he would have crossed at a run 20 years ago. But his hands were steady. That was what mattered. His eyes were clear behind the reading glasses he now needed for close work. His mind was sharp as the day he graduated Ranger School in 1983, top of his class in everything except swimming. Age had taken speed, had taken flexibility, had taken the easy recovery that made young men feel invincible. But age had given things back too, had given patience that came from understanding that rushing usually made things worse, had given calm that came from seeing death up close 100 times and deciding it would have to wait, had given the knowledge that survival was not about being the fastest or the strongest, was about being the smartest, the most patient, the most willing to wait for the right moment instead of forcing the wrong one, was about making fewer mistakes than the other guy. Thomas had made fewer mistakes than a lot of other guys over the years. That was why he was still alive when so many were not. Jordan was in the kitchen when he entered, coffee pot on, the good stuff she bought from a roaster in San Diego, strong and dark the way they both liked it. News playing on the tablet propped against the sugar bowl, the same Border Patrol frequency Thomas had been monitoring outside. The chaos continued to unfold, additional units responding, the medevac helicopter now airborne and racing toward a man who was probably already dead. She looked up when he entered, read his face instantly, knew something had shifted. She was beautiful, looked exactly like her mother had at the same age. Same dark hair that fell past her shoulders when she let it down, usually pulled back in a practical ponytail. Same green eyes that seemed to see through lies and pretense, and the masks people wore to hide their true selves. Same stubborn set to her jaw that said she had made up her mind and arguing was pointless. Rachel had been fierce like that, uncompromising, the kind of woman who would walk through fire for the people she loved and expected them to walk through fire right back. But there was something in Jordan that had not come from her mother, something hard and cold beneath the surface, something that calculated angles and distances without conscious thought, that assessed threats before noting faces, that saw rooms as tactical spaces with firing lines and cover positions. That part came from Thomas. From the training he had given her, starting when she was 12 years old, when he first recognized the aptitude in her, the focus, the icy calm under pressure that could not be taught, only recognized and developed. The Army had never seen it, had never looked past the fact that she was female to assess whether she could actually do the work, had assumed she could not, and closed doors that should have been open to anyone with her capabilities. So Thomas had opened different doors, had taught her everything he knew, had given her the skills that 40 years of special operations had given him, had created something the official military refused to create. A weapon. Jordan gestured to the coffee. Thomas poured himself a cup and sat down at the table his father had built in 1968. Solid oak, the wood dark with age, the surface scarred by 3 generations of Grant family meals and hard conversations. He spoke first, 3 words that changed everything. "We need to talk." Jordan's face stayed neutral, the professional mask that operators learned to wear when civilians asked questions they could not answer. But her eyes flickered for just a moment. Recognition, and maybe relief, like she had been waiting for this conversation, dreading it but needing it. Thomas told her what he knew about the pattern of cartel activity along the border, about the precision shooting that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared before anyone could identify its source, about American units that should have been wiped out but walked away because someone invisible decided to intervene, about the federal agents who had been asking questions in the valley, showing up at neighbors' houses with badges and carefully worded inquiries about unusual activity. Jordan listened, sipped her coffee, let silence stretch between them until it became its own kind of answer. Then she told him the truth. Her call sign was Wraith, had been for 2 years, ever since the Army kicked her out for refusing an illegal order, ever since a colonel named Harrison Blake had ordered her platoon to fire on a building they knew contained civilians. The operation had been routine, at least by the standards of counterinsurgency warfare. Clear a village suspected of harboring insurgent leaders, search houses, detain military-aged males for questioning, move on to the next village and repeat. But the intelligence had been wrong, or the insurgents had anticipated the operation. Either way, what was supposed to be a routine search became a firefight that lasted 6 hours and cost 3 American lives. By the time the shooting stopped, the remaining insurgents had retreated into a residential compound at the edge of the village, a compound that Jordan's recon element had already identified as containing 12 women and at least 8 children. Civilians being used as human shields by enemies who understood American rules of engagement better than some American officers did. Colonel Blake had arrived by helicopter as the sun set, had surveyed the situation with the impatience of a man who had reports to file and metrics to meet in a career to advance, had decided that the insurgents in that compound were high-value targets who needed to be eliminated regardless of collateral damage. He ordered the building destroyed, ordered Jordan's platoon to level it with everything they had, ordered American soldiers to kill women and children because killing them was easier than extracting the insurgents through other means. Jordan refused, stood in front of her commanding officer and said no, documented the order on her helmet camera, cited the specific articles of the UCMJ and the Geneva Conventions that made the order illegal, did everything by the book because she had believed, naively as it turned out, that the book protected soldiers who followed it. Blake had been furious, had screamed at her in front of her entire platoon, had threatened her with court-martial and prison in a dishonorable discharge that would follow her for the rest of her life. But he had not pressed the attack on the compound, had called in helicopters to extract his force instead, had left the insurgents and their human shields behind because Jordan's refusal had created witnesses and documentation that made proceeding too risky. She had thought that it was the end of it, had thought she would face some administrative consequences but ultimately be vindicated because she had been right and everyone knew it. Instead, she discovered how institutions protected their own. Blake had connections that reached into places Jordan could not even identify. Had 30 years of service and ribbons on his chest and friends who owed him favors and enemies who feared him. The investigation that should have ended his career disappeared into bureaucratic quicksand. Witnesses changed their stories. Evidence went missing. Documentation was declared classified and sealed. Jordan found herself facing charges of insubordination, conduct unbecoming an officer, failure to follow lawful orders. The irony was bitter and complete. She had refused an illegal order and was being prosecuted for refusing orders. The trial was brief, the outcome predetermined. Her defense attorney, a JAG captain who was clearly uncomfortable with the whole proceeding, did his best but never had a chance. The system had decided what would happen to Jordan Grant, and no amount of evidence or argument would change that decision. She was discharged. Other than honorable, the kind of discharge that followed you forever, that closed doors before they opened, that told everyone who checked your records that you could not be trusted, that you were trouble, that you had failed to be one of the good soldiers who followed orders without question. The women and children in that compound had survived. Jordan had learned that later through channels that were not official. The insurgents had eventually been captured in a different operation. No one had died because Jordan refused to kill them. But no one acknowledged that. No one thanked her. No one admitted that she had been right and Blake had been wrong. The institution protected itself by punishing the person who had exposed its failure. So Jordan became something else. Decided that serving her country did not require wearing a uniform, just required being in the right place at the right time with the right skills, just required being willing to do what needed to be done when no one else would do it. She had saved 8 American units over the past 2 years. SEALs in the hills above Tecate, Rangers on a cross-border operation that went wrong, Marines providing security for a DEA raid, Border Patrol agents walking into ambushes that should have killed them. Did not matter who they were, only mattered that they were hers. Americans who needed help, who deserved someone watching their backs even when that someone operated outside every regulation and every law and every acceptable boundary. Because the enemy did not care about regulations. The cartels did not follow laws. The men trying to kill Americans used every advantage they could find. So Jordan did the same, became the advantage nobody expected. The ghost in the hills who appeared when hope ran out and disappeared before questions could be asked. Wraith. Thomas felt pride and rage mixing in his chest in equal measure. Pride because his daughter was exactly what he had trained her to be. Competent, deadly, committed to mission above self. Everything he had spent 12 years building into her. Rage because she had done it alone, without backup, without support, without anyone to call if things went wrong, without the safety net that teams provided, without anyone who could pull her out if a mission went sideways. He asked the question that mattered most. Why alone? Why not tell him? Why risk everything when he could have helped? Jordan's answer came quiet and devastating. Because you gave enough. 40 years, 6 continents, 3 wars, more missions than anyone could count. You earned your peace, earned the right to fix fence posts and drink coffee and watch sunsets without worrying about whether you would see another one. She would not take that from him, would not drag him back into darkness just because she chose to stay there. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest. The thing that had been holding back a truth he did not want to face. His daughter thought she was protecting him, thought he was too old, too broken, too finished to be useful anymore. She was wrong. He told her so in words that left no room for argument. Rangers never retired, just changed uniforms. The mission did not end because you took off the official one. Protecting Americans was not a job you could quit. It was identity. It was who you were at the core, who you stayed until your last breath. Tonight, they would go out together. Whatever came next, they would face as a team. Father and daughter, 2 generations of Grant standing together against whoever thought Americans were easy targets. Jordan started to argue. Thomas cut her off with a look. The look that had stopped arguments for 4 decades. The look that made sergeants go silent and lieutenants reconsider. They geared up after dark. The workshop behind the house held secrets that would have interested federal agents. An arsenal that civilians were not supposed to own. M4 carbines with suppressors. Night vision optics, 3 generations beyond anything available commercially. Communications gear that could access frequencies reserved for military and intelligence operations. Jordan showed him her setup. Custom rifle with a precision barrel and advanced optics. The weapon of a professional sniper. They drove separate routes to the observation point, 15 miles south at an abandoned ranch that offered sight lines across the valley. Jordan briefed him on what her intelligence network had discovered. SEAL team operating tonight, 6 men on an interdiction mission. But her sources said the mission was compromised. Said 50 cartel soldiers were waiting in prepared positions. Said it was an ambush designed to kill Americans. Thomas asked about leadership, about who was coordinating cartel military operations. Jordan pulled up surveillance photos on a tablet. Faces captured over months of patient observation. One face made Thomas stop breathing. Older now, scarred, hair gone gray, but unmistakable to someone who had put 6 bullets into that face 30 years ago. Vincent Kane, Delta Force operator, court-martialed in 1994 for running drugs through military transport channels. Escaped before sentencing, disappeared. Thomas had found him in Panama in 1995, running a drug operation, killing civilians who threatened to expose him, using skills the American military had given him to build a criminal empire. Thomas confronted him, gave him the chance to surrender. Vincent chose to fight. 6 rounds, center mass. Thomas watched him fall, watched him bleed, left him for dead in a jungle clearing because dead was what he looked like. Apparently, dead men could hold grudges for 30 years. The radio crackled. SEAL team reporting they were moving into position. Through his scope, Thomas watched 6 Americans approaching what looked like a routine target. Watch them move with the confidence of professionals who had done this 100 times. Watch them walk into a trap they could not see. The compound lit up, floodlights blazing, muzzle flashes from prepared positions, coordinated fire from multiple directions creating interlocking kill zones. The SEALs scattered, seeking cover that barely existed, returning fire against overwhelming numbers. 6 men against 50. The mathematics of certain death. Jordan was already settling into her rifle, controlling her breathing, finding targets. Thomas spotted for her, calling wind and range and adjustments. The partnership they had developed over years of training together clicking into place as if they had done this 1,000 times. Jordan fired. 400 meters away, a cartel spotter dropped dead. Second shot, third, fourth, each round finding a target, each target a key player in the ambush. Radio operators, fire team leaders, the men coordinating the kill zone. Surgical precision, the kind of shooting that could not be taught, only developed in someone with natural talent and years of practice. The SEALs recognized the shift, recognized that someone was helping, adapted instantly, using the confusion to push toward extraction. Thomas keyed his radio on a frequency that should not exist. Wraith and Reaper have your back. The SEAL team leader responded without questioning who they were, only caring that help was effective. Together, Thomas and Jordan eliminated target after target, their coordination absolute, the product of shared blood and shared training and shared commitment. The cartels broke, discipline dissolving under fire from ghosts they could not see, retreating into the darkness they had come from. Helicopters appeared. Extraction for the SEALs. 6 Americans who would go home to their families because invisible angels had intervened. Thomas and Jordan watched until the helicopters disappeared north, then broke down their equipment and vanished into the night. They met at the ranch as dawn approached. Jordan asked what came next. Thomas had been running scenarios all night, calculating options, planning the way Rangers planned. His answer was simple. They would not wait for Vincent to move, would not give him the initiative, would take the fight to him instead. But first they needed help, needed the old crew. Men Thomas had served with decades ago who had never really stopped being warriors. Jordan knew the names: Bull Hendricks, Mike Torres, Eugene Hutchinson, the men who had helped train her, who had recognized her potential when institutions refused to see it. Thomas smiled, first real smile in years. Some bonds never broke. When one ranger called, the others came. That was what brotherhood meant. He would make the calls, build the team, show Vincent Kane that coming after Thomas Grant meant fighting everyone Thomas had ever served with. War was coming, and the last ranger was ready. November 7th, 2025, 05:47 hours, Cascade Valley, California. Thomas Grant made 3 phone calls before dawn. The sky outside the kitchen window was still dark, stars fading slowly as the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon. The coffee in his mug had gone cold an hour ago, but he kept holding it anyway. The ceramic weight familiar and grounding in hands that had held weapons more often than they had held anything peaceful. The mug was a gift from Rachel. World's okayest husband printed on the side in letters that had faded over 15 years of daily use. She had thought it was hilarious when she bought it, had laughed until tears rolled down her cheeks at the expression on his face when he unwrapped it on their 20th anniversary. He had pretended to be offended, had said he was at least world's second okayest husband. She had kissed him and told him not to get cocky. He never used another mug after she died. Could not bring himself to put this one in the cupboard with the others. Could not let go of this small piece of her, even when letting go might have been healthier. Jordan had tried to talk to him about it once, about grief and moving forward, and the way he seemed frozen in the moment of Rachel's death. He had listened politely and then changed the subject. Some things you did not move forward from, some losses you carried forever. Rachel had been the best thing that ever happened to him, and no amount of therapy or time or well-meaning advice would change the fact that her absence was a wound that would never heal. The phone felt heavy in his other hand. 3 calls to make, 3 men to ask for something he had no right to ask. 3 brothers who had their own lives, their own families, their own hard-earned peace. But Rangers answered when Rangers called. That was the code. That was the bond forged in blood and violence, and the shared experience of walking through hell together and coming out the other side. Each call would begin the same way, with a name and a year. The shorthand that old soldiers used when official channels did not exist and official help would not come. The code that meant everything had changed. That the world you thought you had left behind had reached out and pulled you back. That brothers needed brothers and nothing else mattered. The first call went to Tommy Hendricks. Bull. The nickname had stuck since boot camp on Parris Island in 1981, when a drill instructor made the mistake of calling the stocky recruit fat. Bull was not fat, had never been fat, was built like a fire hydrant, 5'9" of compressed muscle and bone, and pure, stubborn determination. He did not argue with the drill instructor. That was not how boot camp worked. Instead, he dropped and did push-ups. Did them until his arms gave out, then did more. Then did more after that, finding reserves of strength that should not have existed, refusing to quit even when his muscles screamed and his lungs burned and his body begged for mercy. The drill instructor finally told him to stop after 2 hours and 347 push-ups. Looked at him with something that might have been respect hidden beneath the required contempt. Called him Bull from that moment forward. The name followed him through 30 years of service, through 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan, through operations in countries that officially never saw American boots on their soil, through a classified deployment in North Africa that had cost him half a squad and given him nightmares he still had not shaken 20 years later. Now Bull was 62 years old and running a gun shop in Cascade Valley called Hendricks Firearms and Coffee, the kind of place where veterans gathered in the morning to drink and talk and remember when they mattered, when their skills meant something, when the country they served actually seemed to care about them. The shop barely broke even most months. Bull did not care about the money. He cared about the community, cared about giving old soldiers a place to be around other old soldiers, a place where nobody looked at you strange when you jumped at loud noises or needed to sit with your back to the wall, or sometimes had to step outside because the crowds were too much and the walls were closing in. His wife Margaret had been asking him to retire for 5 years, to sell the shop and buy the boat he had always talked about and spend their remaining years fishing and visiting grandchildren in 3 different states. Bull kept promising next year, kept finding reasons to stay. The truth was he was afraid of what would happen if he stopped. Afraid that without the routine and the purpose, he would disappear into himself the way so many veterans did. Afraid that the thing keeping him alive was having somewhere to be and something to do, and people who needed him, even if they only needed him to make coffee and tell old war stories. Thomas dialed the number he had memorized decades ago, listened to it ring once, twice. Then Bull's voice, rough as gravel from too many years of shouting over gunfire and helicopter rotors. Wary at this hour because calls before dawn were never good news. Thomas spoke 4 words. Bull. 1995. Panama. Silence on the line, not confusion. Calculation. Memory sorting through decades of operations to find the right file, the right mission, the right context. Thomas could picture him sitting up in bed, Margaret stirring beside him with the instincts of a military wife who had spent 30 years learning to sleep light and wake ready, the bedside lamp clicking on. Bull swinging his legs to the floor with the careful movements of a man whose body had been complaining for years, but who refused to listen. When Bull spoke again, his voice was different, harder, clearer. The voice of a Marine who had spent his life answering calls like this one. When do we leave? Not a question, a statement. No hesitation, no request for details or justification. Just when. That was what brotherhood meant. That was the code. Thomas gave him the basics, Vincent Kane. The name that should have been buried 30 years ago, alive and training cartels to kill Americans. Jordan exposed as the ghost sniper who had been saving American units along the border. The fact that this was personal and illegal and completely off the books. Bull laughed, the sound of a man who had made peace with his own mortality so long ago that the prospect of death had become almost boring. Said he would be there by noon. Said to make sure the coffee was hot because his knees did not work right in the cold anymore and he would need something to take the edge off. Said Margaret would complain, but she had been complaining for 30 years and it never stopped him yet. Said he had been waiting 40 years for someone to call with a mission that actually mattered. Then he hung up before Thomas could respond. That was Bull. Always had been. No time wasted on sentiment when there was work to do. The second call went to Mike Torres. Father Mike now, 58 years old with a priest collar in a parish in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and a past that would have terrified his congregation if they knew the details. Before the collar, he wore ranger tabs. Before he saved souls, he saved bodies. Combat medic with the 2nd Ranger Battalion during the years when Thomas was still leading missions into places the American public would never hear about. 3 silver stars for valor under fire, a bronze star with V device, a purple heart from wounds received in Mogadishu when he kept working on a casualty while his own blood soaked through his uniform. More confirmed kills than most infantry officers accumulated in entire careers. The kind of soldier who could pray over you in the morning and put a bullet through your brain in the afternoon without seeing any contradiction between the two. Mike found God in a foxhole, the oldest cliche in the book, except in his case it was literally true. Mogadishu, October 1993. Same battle that nearly killed Thomas. Mike was treating a wounded ranger named Patterson when an RPG hit the wall above their position. Shrapnel tore through his shoulder and arm. He kept working, kept his hands steady, kept Patterson alive through sheer force of will while his own blood pooled beneath him. Later, he said he heard a voice, not audible, not hallucination, just certainty that came from somewhere beyond himself. That he was meant for something more than killing. That his hands were meant to heal, and his heart was meant to serve, and the skills he had developed were gifts to be used for purpose he had not yet discovered. He finished his 20 years, retired with full benefits and a body full of scars and a mind full of memories. Entered seminary at 39, the oldest student in his class by a decade. Became a priest at 43. Returned to the border communities where he had grown up poor and hungry and desperate, where he could do the most good for people who needed it most. But he never forgot what he was, never lost the skills, never stopped being ready for the call that might come someday. He kept his medical kit packed in the same duffel bag he had used in Somalia. Updated the supplies regularly with medications obtained through channels the bishop would not have approved. Kept his hands steady through practice at the shooting range he had built behind the church, where parishioners thought he was running youth programs. He was running youth programs. Among other things, the kids who came to learn marksmanship also learned discipline and responsibility and the difference between strength used for good and strength used for evil. More than a few had found their way out of gang life through those programs. More than a few were alive today because Father Mike had given them something to believe in besides the violence that surrounded them. Thomas dialed the number. Mike answered on the 2nd ring, his voice alert despite the hour. Priests learned to be ready for calls at any time. People died at inconvenient hours. Crises did not respect schedules. Thomas spoke the code words, Mike, 1995. Panama. Father Mike did not hesitate, did not ask for details, did not need them. The trust built over decades of shared danger was enough. He said he would need to find someone to cover Sunday services. Said Father Rodriguez at the cathedral owed him a favor. Said the bishop would not approve but God would understand. Said sometimes the shepherd had to become the wolf to protect the flock. Said he still had his kit, still had the skills, still remembered how to keep men alive when their bodies wanted to die. Said he would be there by afternoon. The 3rd call was the hardest. Eugene Hutchinson. Hutch, 60 years old and living in a cabin in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado that he had not left in almost 3 years. Air Force Pararescue. The PJs. The men who jumped out of helicopters into the worst situations imaginable and brought people out alive. Who lived by a motto that defined everything they were. That others may live. Not a suggestion, not an aspiration, an identity, a commitment so deep it became who you were at the cellular level, a willingness to trade your own life for someone else's without hesitation or regret. Hutch had lived that motto for 25 years, had jumped into hostile territory more times than he could count, had pulled wounded soldiers out of kill zones while bullets cracked past his head, had kept men alive through sheer stubborn refusal to let them die, had carried the wounded on his back through miles of hostile terrain because leaving them was not an option, would never be an option, was against everything he believed and everything he was. He earned every medal the Air Force could give, the Air Force Cross for extraordinary heroism, multiple Bronze Stars, multiple Purple Hearts, commendations from every branch and several foreign governments. He refused most of them, said medals felt like celebration, and he never felt like celebrating when someone got hurt bad enough to need rescue. The best rescue was the one you never had to make. The best mission was the one where nobody got wounded in the first place. Then Syria happened. 2016. An IED buried in a road that was supposed to be cleared. A convoy escort mission that should have been routine. Nothing in Syria was routine, but they had done this run a dozen times without incident, and complacency had crept in the way it always did eventually. The bomb killed the driver instantly, wounded 3 others, turned Hutch's right leg into something that barely functioned. Shrapnel severed tendons and shattered bone in ways that surgeons could only partially repair. He would walk again, they told him. Running was uncertain, jumping was impossible. The physical damage ended his career. The mental damage almost ended his life. Hutch's son David was a Marine lieutenant, 26 years old, stationed at Camp Pendleton, training for deployment to Afghanistan. Young and strong and so proud to follow his father into service that it made Hutch's chest ache every time he saw the boy in uniform. David died in a training accident that should never have happened. Live fire exercise where someone loaded the wrong ammunition, safety protocols ignored. A young lieutenant caught a round that was never supposed to be in that weapon. He died in his father's arms. Hutch had been visiting the base, watching the exercise from an observation point, had sprinted across the range when the shooting stopped and the screaming started, had held David while the medics worked, had felt the exact moment his son's heart stopped beating, had screamed at God and the Corps and the universe until his voice gave out. The investigation found failures at every level: inadequate supervision, improper ammunition storage, training schedules rushed to meet deployment timelines, a culture of shortcuts that prioritized statistics over safety. Nobody went to prison, a few letters of reprimand. The Marine Corps expressed regret, promised to do better, moved on. Hutch buried his son next to his wife. Cancer had taken her when David was 17. Now they were together again, and Hutch was alone with his pain and his rage and his absolute certainty that the universe had made a mistake, that he should have died instead, that fathers were supposed to protect their sons and he had failed. He disappeared into a bottle in a cabin in the mountains, stopped answering calls, stopped responding to letters, made it clear he wanted to be left alone with his grief. Thomas had respected that wish for 3 years, had sent cards on holidays that were probably never opened, had left voicemails that were probably never played, had given Hutch the space to grieve because that was what you did for brothers who needed to fall apart before they could put themselves back together. But now Thomas needed him, needed the best extraction specialist he had ever worked with, needed someone who understood terrain and timing and the mathematics of getting people out of impossible situations. Needed Hutch to remember who he was before tragedy broke him. The phone rang 8 times. Thomas almost hung up, almost decided this was a mistake, that asking was cruel, that some men could not be called back from the dark. Then a voice, raw, suspicious, hostile, the voice of someone who had given up on everything except the next drink and the oblivion it promised. Thomas spoke the words anyway. Hutch, 1995, Panama. Long silence. Longer than the others. Thomas heard breathing, heard the clink of a bottle being set down on wood, heard movement, a chair scraping, footsteps crossing a floor. Then Hutch spoke again and his voice was different, clearer, harder, something waking up that had been dormant for years. He said he was 60 days sober, said some days he wanted a drink so bad his hands shook and his teeth ached and every cell in his body screamed for the numbness that alcohol provided. But he did not give in, did not take that drink, did not let the darkness win. Because his son died and Hutch could not save him. But maybe he could save someone else. Maybe he could matter again. Maybe he could prove that the man David believed in still existed somewhere beneath all the pain and guilt and self-destruction. Said his leg still did not work right, but his brain did. Said he had been waiting 3 years for a reason to give a damn about something, for a mission that mattered more than the pain. Said he would be there by sunset. Thomas set the phone down and felt something he had not felt in years. The weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. The knowledge that men were counting on him, that he had set something in motion that would end with blood no matter how carefully he planned. But also hope, the certainty that he was no longer alone, that the weight would be shared, that whatever came next would be faced by brothers who understood. Jordan found him in the kitchen an hour later. She had slept maybe 3 hours. Dark circles under eyes that were still sharp and alert. Body tired but ready. The operator mode that never fully switched off. The constant readiness that became habit after enough time in hostile environments. She asked who he called. He told her, watched her face process the names. She knew them all. Uncle Bull, who had taught her hand-to-hand fighting when she was 15, who had shown her how to break bones and crush windpipes without hesitation, who had told her that fighting fair was for people who wanted to lose. Father Mike, who had heard her confession after her first kill, a training accident at the range, a ricochet that found an instructor standing in the wrong place. Not her fault, but guilt did not care about fault. Mike had listened without judgment, had helped her understand that carrying guilt for accidents was a choice, that forgiving yourself was not the same as forgetting. Hutch, who had shown her how to navigate by stars when GPS failed, who had taught her that technology was a tool but skills were forever, who had made her memorize terrain and calculate distances and read the land like a book, who had told her that pararescue meant being the person who showed up when everyone else gave up. The men who had helped raise her, who had seen her potential when institutions refused to look, who had trained her because not training her seemed more dangerous than breaking regulations. Now they were coming. The morning passed in preparation. Thomas pulled weapons from the hidden safe in his workshop, the arsenal that federal agents would have been very interested to learn about. M4 carbines with suppressors and advanced optics, night vision equipment that was still technically classified, body armor with ceramic plates rated to stop rifle rounds, grenades, both flashbang and fragmentation, communications gear that could access frequencies reserved for military and intelligence operations. He had accumulated this equipment over decades through channels that were not exactly legal, but were not exactly illegal either. Gifts from grateful soldiers whose lives he had saved, purchases from contractors who did not ask questions, equipment that had been written off as lost or destroyed and found its way to people who could still use it. Jordan inventoried ammunition, 5,000 rounds of various calibers, 9mm for pistols, 5.56 for the carbines, 7.62 for the precision rifles. Match grade, hand-loaded for consistency, the difference between hitting and missing at extended range. Not enough for sustained combat, enough for a raid, enough for getting in and getting out fast. Enough for the kind of operation Thomas had in mind. They spread satellite imagery across the kitchen table. Vincent Kane's compound in Mexico, 50 miles south of the border. An old ranch converted into a fortress. Adobe walls 15 feet high and thick enough to stop rifle rounds. Guard towers at regular intervals. Heavy weapons in prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire. Barracks buildings that could house 100 men. Training grounds where cartel soldiers learned American tactics from an American trader. The kind of target that would require a company to assault properly. Air support, artillery, armor. The full combined arms package that military doctrine prescribed for attacking defended positions. They had 5 people, 3 over 60, 1 with a leg that barely worked. Thomas had faced worse odds, not often, but sometimes. Bull Hendricks arrived at 11:30. His truck had seen better days, dents and scratches and a windshield crack that stretched from corner to corner. But the engine ran smooth and the suspension had been upgraded for rough terrain, and the lock cases in the bed made metallic sounds when they shifted. He climbed out slowly, 62 years showing in every careful movement. But his handshake was iron and his eyes were clear, and his smile was the same one Thomas remembered from 100 missions. The smile that said, "Bring it on." Thomas briefed him on everything: Vincent Kane, the compound, the odds, the fact that this was completely illegal and probably suicidal. Bull listened, asked tactical questions, numbers, weapons, defensive positions, extraction routes. The questions of a professional assessing a target. When Thomas finished, Bull had one question. When? Father Mike Torres arrived at 3. He wore civilian clothes but carried himself like a soldier. Hard to hide 40 years of military bearing. The way he stood. The way his eyes scanned for threats even in friendly territory. The way his hands stayed loose and ready at his sides. He embraced Thomas, brief and solid, communicating things words could not express. Decades of friendship, absolute trust, the willingness to die for each other that came from having already nearly died for each other more than once. Mike looked at Jordan and saw the operator she had become, saw the warrior, saw someone who would have made the finest soldier in any army, but who had been failed by institutions too blind to see her potential. He asked about casualties, about what Thomas expected. Thomas told him the truth, did not know, hoped everyone came home, planned for that, But Vincent Kane was not an amateur, was dangerous and prepared and motivated by 30 years of hatred, would not go down easy. Mike nodded, said he understood, said he could keep people alive if they got hurt, could not promise more than that, could not guarantee anything except his best effort and his prayers. Eugene Hutchinson arrived at sunset. His Jeep was barely functional, rust spots on the fenders, engine that sounded terminal, but it had carried him 600 miles from Colorado, and he had arrived when he said he would. He climbed out slowly, carefully, the movements of someone who lived with constant pain, who had learned to function despite it, who refused to let it define him even when it tried. Hutch looked worse than Thomas remembered, thinner, older, harder, the look of someone who had walked through fire and not quite made it all the way through to the other side. But his eyes were clear, actually clear, not the glassy look of medication or the red rim of drinking. The eyes of someone who had found something to live for after years of wanting to die. Thomas gripped his shoulder, did not ask about the drinking, did not mention the sun, just treated him like what he was, a warrior, a brother, a pararescueman who had spent his life saving others and was finally ready to save himself by saving someone else. They gathered in the barn as evening fell. The building had stood since 1952, when Thomas's grandfather expanded the ranch after a good year selling cattle. The wood had aged to a deep gray, the planks warped slightly by decades of desert heat and cold. Hay dust floated in the slanting light that came through gaps in the walls. The smell was old and familiar, horses and leather, and the particular mustiness of buildings that had seen generations of use. Thomas had set up a table in the center with the satellite imagery spread across it, laptops showing additional angles, notebooks filled with his observations from the past 48 hours. Everything he knew about Vincent Kane's operation laid out for his team to analyze. 5 people standing in a loose circle around that table. Combined age of 313 years. Combined experience measured in decades of service across every branch and every continent, in missions that would never be acknowledged by any official history. Jordan stood slightly apart, watching the men her father had trained with, watching the way they moved and spoke and assessed information, recognizing the professionalism that came from a lifetime of this work, recognizing herself in them, the person she had become through their teaching. Bull studied the compound imagery with the intensity of a man who had assaulted defended positions before and understood exactly what they were looking at. His finger traced the wall perimeter, noting guard positions and weapons emplacements. His lips moved slightly as he calculated fields of fire and dead spaces. Mike examined the terrain surrounding the compound, looking for approach routes and extraction options. His medical mind was already cataloging the injuries they might sustain, the supplies he would need, the triage decisions he might have to make. Hutch focused on the canyon system, seeing paths where others saw obstacles. His pararescue training had taught him to find ways through terrain that seemed impassable, had taught him that extraction was not about easy routes, but about possible routes. Thomas briefed them on everything: Vincent Kane's history, the betrayal in Panama, the 30 years of empire building, the cartel training operation that had turned criminal thugs into professional soldiers, the American tactics being used against Americans, the compound itself, 15-foot walls, guard towers every 50 meters, heavy weapons in prepared positions, 60 or more fighters with military training and military discipline. The numbers: 5 of them against 60 defenders. An assault that military doctrine would require a company plus air support plus artillery to execute properly. The fact that this was suicide by any reasonable standard of tactical analysis. But they were not reasonable people, had never been reasonable, had spent their lives doing unreasonable things because reasonable people stayed home and let others do the hard work. Bull asked about approach, how they would get close enough to matter without being detected and destroyed. The compound sat in open desert, no cover for hundreds of meters in any direction. Any direct approach would be spotted by guards or sensors long before they reached the walls. The floodlights alone would illuminate attackers like targets in a shooting gallery. They needed another way, a path that avoided the obvious approaches, a route that would bring them close enough to strike before the defenders could organize. Hutch had the answer, had been studying the map since he arrived, seeing the terrain with eyes trained by 20 years of getting people out of impossible situations. The same skills that made him the best extraction specialist Thomas had ever worked with also made him excellent at finding ways into places that seemed unreachable. He traced a line on the satellite imagery, a canyon system that began 30 miles north of the compound and wound through the mountains before emerging less than a mile from Vincent's position. No roads anywhere near it, no trails, no reason for anyone to patrol it because no one in their right mind would try to move through that terrain. 30 miles of rough country, rock and sand and elevation changes that would exhaust men half their age. 12 hours of hiking through darkness, navigating by stars and GPS, moving carefully to avoid the twisted ankles and falls that could end a mission before it began. But at the end of that hike, they would emerge on a ridge overlooking the compound, would have sight lines for sniper overwatch and a drainage channel that led most of the way to the wall. Could they make it? 5 men with combined injuries that included bad backs and rebuilt knees and legs that barely functioned. Bull said he could make it, said his knees had been complaining for 20 years and he had not let them stop him yet. Said pain was temporary, but regret was forever. Mike said he could make it, said God had not kept him alive through Mogadishu and a dozen other firefights just to let him quit now. Said his body would do what his will required. Hutch said he could make it, said his leg might give out along the way, but he would crawl if he had to. Said Pararescue trained you to keep moving no matter what, because the people counting on you did not care about your excuses. Thomas looked at Jordan, his daughter who was 37 years younger and infinitely more capable than any of them. She would carry the sniper rifle, would establish overwatch on the ridge, would be the angel watching over them as they crossed the killing ground. She nodded, said she could make any shot they needed, said she had been preparing for something like this her whole life even if she did not know it. Said she was honored to fight beside men who had shaped everything she had become. The plan came together piece by piece. Insert by vehicle at a trailhead 20 miles from the canyon entrance. Move on foot through the night, using the terrain for concealment. Reach the ridge overlooking the compound by dawn, when guards would be at their least alert after a long night shift. Jordan would establish overwatch and begin eliminating key targets. Guards in towers, men on heavy weapons, anyone who looked like they were giving orders. The assault team would move through the drainage channel to the generator that powered the compound. Disable it. Cut the lights and communications. Create darkness and confusion. Then sprint for the wall, breach the entrance, fight through to the command bunker where Vincent would be waiting. Kill him. Extract via helicopter that Hutch's contacts would have standing by. Be across the border before Mexican authorities could respond. Simple. Straightforward. Almost certainly fatal for some or all of them. Mike asked about casualties, about evacuation, about what happened if someone went down in hostile territory with no official support and no air cover and no quick reaction force that could pull them out. Hutch had contacts, civilian helicopter pilots, who flew tourists by day and other things by night, who did not ask questions when the money was right. He could have extraction standing by, medical waiting, a way out if everything went wrong. Jordan asked the question no one else would ask, whether they were ready to kill. Not targets, not enemies. Men, human beings with families and lives and futures. The barn went quiet. Thomas answered first. 37 confirmed kills in his career. Remembered every one, it never got easier. But sometimes killing was necessary. Protecting the innocent required destroying the guilty. Bull spoke next. Killing was always wrong, always carried cost. But not killing when killing could prevent greater harm was worse. Was cowardice dressed up as morality. Mike added his voice. God understood that evil existed, that protecting the innocent sometimes required violence, that love for victims sometimes looked like wrath against victimizers. Hutch spoke last. His son died because someone did not do their job, because someone cut corners. He would not be that person, would carry whatever weight the mission required. They were ready, committed, willing to accept whatever cost the mission demanded. But readiness was not just physical, was not just about weapons and routes and tactics. There was a mental preparation required for what they were about to do, a reckoning with the reality that they would kill people tonight, would end lives, would make choices that could never be unmade. Thomas had done this reckoning many times before, had learned long ago how to compartmentalize the killing, how to keep it separate from the rest of who he was. But even after 40 years, it never became routine, never became easy. Every life taken left a mark on your soul that you carried forever. Bull had his own way of dealing with it. Told himself that the men they would kill had chosen their path, had chosen to work for a traitor who trained murderers, had chosen to be enemies of everything Bull had spent his life defending. They were combatants in an undeclared war, and combatants accepted the risk of death when they took up arms. Mike prayed, asked God to guide their hands and steady their aim, asked for forgiveness in advance for the violence they would commit, reminded himself that protecting the innocent sometimes required destroying the guilty, that love for victims sometimes manifested as wrath against victimizers. Hutch thought about David, about the son he had lost because someone had not done their job, because someone had been careless or lazy or incompetent. He would not be that person tonight, would not fail the people counting on him, would carry whatever weight the mission placed on his shoulders because that weight was lighter than the weight of knowing you could have done more and did not. Jordan watched the men process what was coming, recognized the rituals because she had developed her own over 2 years of operating alone. The way you settled your mind before violence, the way you made peace with what you were about to become, the way you separated the killer from the person so that when it was over, you could go back to being human. They spent the evening in final preparations, checking gear. Every weapon cleaned and loaded and function tested, every piece of equipment verified, every round of ammunition counted. They would not have supply lines or resupply points. What they carried was what they had. Nothing could be forgotten. Loading magazines, the repetitive motion almost meditative, brass sliding against brass, the weight of each magazine increasing as rounds filled it, 40 magazines between them, 1,200 rounds of 5.56, 200 rounds of 7.62 for Jordan's rifle, 600 rounds of 9mm for sidearms, plus grenades, flashbangs for breaching, fragmentation for when they needed to clear rooms without exposing themselves, smoke for concealment, plus medical supplies, tourniquets and pressure bandages and chest seals, morphine auto-injectors for pain that would otherwise be incapacitating, Mike's full trauma kit with everything needed to keep someone alive long enough to reach a hospital, running through drills that their bodies remembered even when their minds had moved on, room clearing, movement techniques, hand signals, the choreography of violence that became instinct after enough repetition, testing communications, making sure everyone could hear everyone else, making sure the frequencies were clear, making sure Jordan on Overwatch could talk to the assault team and vice versa, reviewing contingencies. What to do if someone went down, what to do if they were separated, what to do if the extraction helicopter did not show. Backup plans for backup plans because Murphy's Law applied to combat operations more than anywhere else. The hours passed, the sun set, darkness fell over the valley. The team gathered one final time as midnight approached. They stood in a loose circle beside the vehicles that would carry them to the start point. 5 people about to do something that would change everything. That would probably kill some or all of them. That had to be done anyway because the alternative was worse. Thomas looked at each of them in turn. At Bull with his Marine determination. At Mike with his warrior priest duality. At Hutch with his desperate need to matter again. At Jordan with the skills he had given her and the courage she had found on her own. These were the best people he had ever known. The best soldiers, the best friends, the best family. He told them so, told them what their friendship had meant across decades of service, what their presence here tonight meant, how honored he was to fight beside them one more time. Bull told him to save the speeches. They could get emotional after, when they were drinking beer and telling war stories about the night a bunch of old guys assaulted a cartel fortress. Right now there was work to do. Mike smiled and said he would pray for all of them, that God was with them even in this dark place, that whatever happened, they were doing the right thing. Hutch said nothing, just nodded. His eyes said everything that words could not. Gratitude, determination, the desperate hope that this mission would finally let him forgive himself for David. Jordan hugged her father, brief and fierce, said she was proud of him, proud to be his daughter, proud to fight beside him. They loaded into the vehicles, checked weapons one final time, moved out into the darkness, heading south, toward Mexico, toward Vincent Kane, toward justice, toward the reckoning that was 30 years overdue. November 8, 2025, 03:47 hours, Sonoran Desert, Mexico. The canyon swallowed them whole. 30 miles of rock and shadow and silence broken only by the sound of boots on ancient stone. 5 figures moving through darkness like ghosts, like memories, like the warriors they had always been beneath the years and the scars and the comfortable pretense of retirement. The night was cold, desert cold, the kind that surprised people who associated sand with heat. Temperature had dropped 40 degrees since sunset, and their breath came out in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the dry air. Thomas had seen men die from exposure in deserts, had seen hypothermia take soldiers who made the mistake of thinking they would be warm because they were surrounded by sand. They wore layers, technical clothing designed for exactly this kind of operation: moisture-wicking base layers, insulating mid-layers, wind-resistant outer shells. The equipment had improved dramatically since Thomas started his career, when they had made do with whatever surplus gear they could scrounge. The canyon walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, carved by water that had not flowed here for 10,000 years. Sandstone and limestone layered in bands of red and orange and gray, geological history written in rock that predated human existence by millions of years. Once this had been a river, cutting through the desert floor toward an ocean that no longer existed. Now it was a dry wound in the earth, a path that led through terrain too harsh for roads, too remote for development, too forgotten for anyone to guard. Moonlight filtered down into the canyon, enough to navigate by, but not enough to see clearly. They moved with night vision when needed, the green glow transforming the landscape into something alien and strange. But mostly they moved by feel, by instinct, by the accumulated experience of men who had spent their lives traveling through darkness. Thomas led, setting the pace, reading the terrain, finding the path through boulder fields and across dry stream beds and around obstacles that would have been dangerous in daylight and were deadly in the dark. He had done this more times than he could count, had led men through worse terrain and worse conditions, had navigated by stars when GPS did not exist, and by instinct when clouds blocked the stars. The skills remained even as the body declined. The mind remembered even as the muscles forgot. Every step hurt. His back sent shooting pains down his spine. His knees ground with every movement. His lungs burned in the thin air. But pain was familiar. Pain was an old companion. Pain could be managed, compartmentalized, set aside until the mission was complete. That was what age gave you if you let it. Not freedom from pain, but the ability to function despite it. The knowledge that your body would complain but did not get to make decisions. The understanding that will was stronger than flesh if your will was strong enough. Behind him, Jordan moved with the silent efficiency of a natural predator. She had learned these skills early, had practiced them until they became as natural as breathing. Watch her move and you would see no wasted motion, no unnecessary sound, no sign of the exertion that must have been burning in her muscles. She was the future, the continuation of everything Thomas had built, the proof that the skills and values he had dedicated his life to would outlive him. Bull came next, his knees protesting with every step, but his determination never wavering. He had been moving through hostile terrain since before Thomas met him, had learned to manage pain and exhaustion in conditions that would have broken most people. His breath came harder than it should have. His body worked harder than younger men's bodies would have. But he never slowed, never complained, never gave any indication that he was anything other than completely ready for whatever came next. That was what Marines were, what they had always been. Men who kept going when everything said they should stop, who found reserves of strength that should not have existed, who defined themselves by their refusal to quit. Mike moved with the steady pace of a man who had learned patience through decades of hard use. His pack was heaviest, loaded with medical supplies that might mean the difference between life and death before the night was over. He carried that weight without complaint because the weight was purpose, was the means by which he would keep his brothers alive. He prayed as he walked, lips moving silently, finding comfort in the ancient words that had sustained him through worse situations than this. God was with them. Mike believed that absolutely. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, they were not alone. Hutch struggled. There was no pretending otherwise. His legs screamed with every step, the damaged nerves sending fire through his hip and down his thigh. The rebuilt knee clicked and ground and threatened to give out. Every footfall was an act of will, a conscious decision to keep moving when his body begged him to stop. But stopping was not an option, had never been an option for a man who had spent his life going into impossible situations to bring people out. The motto that defined Pararescue defined him too, had become part of his identity in a way that nothing else ever had. That others may live. He had failed to save his son, had not been able to prevent the accident that took David from him. But he could save others, could still matter, could still prove that the motto was real and the man who lived by it was not a fraud. So he kept moving, one agonizing step at a time, finding strength he did not know he had because the alternative was unacceptable. The hours passed. The canyon wound through the mountains, following the path that ancient water had carved, sometimes narrow enough that they had to move single file with rock walls close enough to touch on either side, sometimes opening into small valleys where the moonlight pooled and the sky was visible overhead. They stopped twice to rest, brief pauses to drink water and check equipment and let burning muscles recover slightly. Thomas watched his team during these stops, assessing their condition, looking for signs of injury or exhaustion that might compromise the mission. Bull was hurting but functional. The shoulder wound from earlier firefights had not reopened, and his spirit remained strong. He would be ready when they reached the compound. Mike was steady, had found his rhythm, showed no signs of the fatigue that must have been accumulating in his 58-year-old body. The pack weight that would have crushed younger men did not seem to slow him. Hutch was the concern. His face was gray with pain, even in the green glow of night vision. His movements were becoming more labored, his limp more pronounced. But his eyes were clear and his jaw was set, and he showed no intention of stopping. Jordan was fine, more than fine. She moved through this terrain like she had been born to it, which in a sense she had. The desert was home to her in ways it would never be home to the others. She knew its rhythms and its dangers and its hidden paths. Thomas gave the signal to continue. They had miles still to cover and dawn was approaching. The assault needed to happen at first light, when the guards would be at their least alert, when the transition from night shift to day shift created moments of confusion and vulnerability. Thomas Grant led the way, 65 years old and feeling every single one of them, body protesting each step with a symphony of complaints that would have sent most men his age to bed with heating pads and pain medication, and the resigned acceptance that their best days were behind them. Back screaming from the compressed vertebrae that would never fully heal. The injury from Somalia, from the helicopter crash that should have killed him, sending fire down his spine with every footfall. The pain had been a constant companion for 32 years now. He had learned to function through it, had learned that pain was information, not command. You could acknowledge it without obeying it. Knees grinding bone on bone because the cartilage was gone, worn away by 4 decades of running and jumping and carrying loads that would break younger men. The titanium replacement in his left leg clicked with every stride, a mechanical reminder that parts of him were no longer original equipment. The surgery in 2005 had given him back mobility, but had taken away the fluid movement he used to have. Everything was harder now. Everything took more effort. Lungs burning in the thin, cold air of the high desert. At 65, his cardiovascular system was not what it had been at 35. Running left him breathless now. Climbing exhausted him. The altitude, only 4,000 feet, felt like 10,000 had felt when he was young. But he kept moving, one foot in front of the other, the same way he had moved forward through jungles and mountains and deserts across 6 continents. The body was a tool. Tools did not get opinions. Tools did their job until they broke. He was not broken yet. Jordan followed close behind him, silent, efficient, moving with the economy of motion he had spent 12 years teaching her. No wasted energy, no unnecessary sound. Each step placed precisely where it needed to be. Her rifle rode across her back in a tactical sling, the weight so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. She was everything Thomas had trained her to be. Everything the Army had refused to see. Competent and deadly and absolutely committed to mission success. The finest soldier he had ever created, and he had created hundreds over his career. Bull Hendricks came next. 62 years of Marine Corps toughness wrapped in a body that had been complaining for decades and had given up expecting anyone to listen. His knees sounded like gravel in a can. His back felt like someone had driven railroad spikes between his vertebrae. The shrapnel near his spine sent shooting pains down his left leg with every step. But Marines did not quit, did not complain, did not surrender just because things were hard. Bull had learned that lesson at boot camp 40 years ago and had never forgotten it. Pain was temporary. Regret was forever. You kept moving until you could not move anymore, and even then you found a way. He was grinning in the darkness, actually grinning despite the pain and the exhaustion and the near certainty that this mission would get some or all of them killed. Because this was what he had been waiting for. This was what he had been missing since retirement. Purpose. Mission. The feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Margaret would understand. She always understood, even when she complained. 30 years of marriage had taught her that some calls you answered no matter what the cost. This was one of those calls. Father Mike Torres moved through the darkness with the steady pace of a man who had done this before. Many times. In many places. His pack weighed 60 pounds, medical supplies and ammunition and equipment that could save lives or end them depending on what the mission required. He prayed as he walked, the Jesus prayer repeating in his mind with each step. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Finding rhythm in the ancient words, finding the center that would let him do what needed doing when the time came. He had killed before, many times, had made peace with it long ago. Violence in service of protection was not the same as violence in service of evil. The sin was forgiven even before it was committed, as long as the intention was righteous. Vincent Kane trained killers, taught cartels how to murder Americans, had spent 30 years spreading death across the border. Stopping him was not sin. Stopping him was service. Mike would pray for Vincent's soul after, would ask God to have mercy on a man who had chosen evil. But he would not hesitate when the moment came, would not let conscience interfere with necessity. Eugene Hutchinson brought up the rear. His right leg screamed with every step. Pain that made his eyes water and his jaw clench and his whole body beg for rest. The nerve damage from the IED sent fire through his hip with every footfall. The rebuilt knee clicked and ground and threatened to buckle. The muscle surgeons had reattached worked, but not well, not smoothly. 3 years ago he would have quit, would have sat down and let the others go on without him, would have reached for the bottle that had been his only companion since David died. But he was 60 days sober now, 60 days of fighting the craving that never went away, 60 days of proving that the man his son believed in still existed somewhere beneath all the damage, that others may live. The motto that had defined his entire adult life, the commitment that did not expire just because his body was broken. If he could save one life on this mission, just one, then all the pain would be worth it. Then David's death would mean something because it had finally forced his father to stop destroying himself. He would keep moving until his leg gave out completely, until he had nothing left to give. Dawn came gray and cold, light filtering into the canyon in stages, the stars fading, the sky shifting from black to purple to gray, the first direct rays of sun touching the highest peaks and painting them gold while shadows still filled the canyon floor. Thomas called a halt at the final rally point, a ridge overlooking Vincent Kane's compound, 200 meters of open ground between them and the outer wall. The position Hutch had identified on the satellite imagery, the perfect spot for overwatch and assault staging. Through binoculars, Thomas studied what they were facing. The compound was worse than the photos had suggested. Adobe walls not 12 feet but 15, thick enough to stop anything short of heavy weapons. Guard towers every 50 meters along the perimeter, each manned by alert sentries with automatic weapons, heavy machine guns in sandbag positions covering every approach, razor wire along the top of the walls, motion sensors and cameras that created overlapping fields of surveillance. Maybe 60 men visible, moving with discipline, changing shifts with military precision. No casual conversations, no distracted cigarette breaks. Professional soldiers, not cartel thugs. Vincent had trained them well. Bull crawled to Thomas's position and studied the target. His assessment was immediate and brutal. Suicide. Worse than suicide. They were 5 old men against a fortified position defended by 60 trained fighters. The mathematics said they would die. Said they would not even make it to the wall. Thomas nodded. He knew the mathematics, had been doing them since they started planning. But mathematics did not account for everything. Did not factor in experience. Did not factor in desperation. Did not factor in the willingness to accept costs that reasonable people would never accept. They were not reasonable people. Had never been. Hutch pointed out a drainage channel that ran from the ridge toward the compound. A shallow depression that would provide concealment for 50 meters, reduce the exposed ground to 150 meters. Still a killing field, but a smaller one. And there was the generator, a diesel unit outside the wall that powered the compound's electricity, the floodlights, the communications equipment, the sensors. If they could disable it, the compound would go dark. The defenders would lose their technological advantage. Confusion would spread. In confusion, there was opportunity. Jordan settled into her firing position on the ridge, built her rest from rocks and dirt, adjusted her scope, controlled her breathing. Her job was overwatch, eliminate key targets, the guards in the towers, the men on the heavy weapons, the leaders who would try to coordinate defense, create chaos that the assault team could exploit. The assault team would move through the drainage channel. Thomas and Bull and Mike and Hutch reach the generator, plant charges, blow it and use the darkness to close the remaining distance to the wall. Then violence. Fast, brutal, overwhelming. The Ranger way hit so hard and so fast that the enemy could not respond. Get inside the walls before they organized. Fight through to the command bunker where Vincent waited. End him. Extract. Go home. Simple plan, almost certainly fatal, but it was the only plan they had. Thomas looked at his team, at Bull grinning despite the odds, at Mike praying, at Hutch focused through his pain, at Jordan calm and ready on her rifle. These were his brothers, his family. The people who had come when he called because that was what brotherhood meant. People who would die beside him today if that was what the mission required. He hoped it would not come to that. Hoped they would all go home. But hope was not strategy. They would do the job regardless of hope. He spoke quietly, told them what they meant to him, what their friendship had meant across 4 decades of service and sacrifice. Bull told him to save it, get emotional after, when they were drinking beer and telling war stories. Right now, there was work. Mike smiled and said he would pray for them all, that God was with them even here. Hutch just nodded, his eyes saying everything words could not, that he was grateful for this chance, grateful to matter again. Thomas gave the signal. Go. Jordan's rifle spoke first. The suppressed shot was barely audible, a soft cough that the wind carried away. But 370 meters downrange, a guard in the nearest tower snapped backward, dead before he hit the floor. Second shot, another tower, another guard down. Third shot, the man on the nearest heavy weapon, center mass, dropped. The assault team was already moving, sliding into the drainage channel, crawling through dirt and rocks and thorny brush that tore at their clothes. Thomas led, body screaming, mind silent, focused only on movement, on covering ground, on getting to the generator before the compound figured out what was happening. Behind him, Bull crawled with the efficiency born of decades of practice. Then Mike, then Hutch, dragging his bad leg, refusing to let it slow the team. Jordan's rifle kept speaking, methodical, precise, each shot finding a target. Guards dropping, confusion spreading. The compound was coming alive now. Alarms sounding, men shouting, floodlights sweeping across the open ground. But they did not know where the fire was coming from, did not know which direction to face, did not understand that death was crawling toward them through a shallow ditch. The team reached the generator. Thomas planted charges while the others provided security. Small explosives shaped to destroy the fuel tank and the main power coupling. He worked quickly, hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. Triggered the detonation remotely. The generator erupted, diesel fuel catching fire, flames leaping into the pre-dawn sky. The compound's lights flickered and died. Darkness descended like a blanket. They had night vision. The defenders did not. The team broke from cover, running now, sprinting across open ground while Jordan's rifle covered them. 150 meters of vulnerability, bullets cracking past, dirt kicking up around their feet. But they were hard to see in the darkness, hard to hit. And every time a muzzle flash revealed a defender's position, Jordan put a round through him. They reached the wall. Bull did not slow down, did not hesitate, hit the wooden doors at full speed with all the momentum his body could generate, his bulk crashing through wood that was not designed to stop a Marine running on adrenaline and fury, and 30 years of accumulated grievance against everyone who had ever said he was too old to matter. The doors splintered, gave way, shattered inward in a spray of splinters and dust. They were inside. The compound's interior was chaos. Guards running in every direction, some heading toward the breach, some heading away from it, some frozen in confusion, unable to process what was happening. The floodlights were dead. The communications were dead. The carefully prepared defensive plans were useless because they had been designed around coordinated response, and there was no coordination anymore. Just individual men making individual decisions in the dark. Close quarters combat now. The kind of fighting that happened at arm's length, where you could see the faces of the men you killed, where death was personal in a way that long-range shooting never was. Rifles up, eyes scanning, bodies moving through the compound and choreography learned through decades of practice. Room-clearing techniques drilled so deeply that they happened without conscious thought. Thomas went left, toward the main building where intelligence said the command bunker was located. Toward Vincent. Bull went right, securing their flank, engaging anyone who tried to come at them from that direction. Mike covered center, ready to provide medical support, ready to fight when fighting was needed. Hutch stayed near the breach. His bad leg made him the slowest, made him liability in a running fight. But he could still shoot, could still cover the exit they would need when extraction time came. Guards appeared from a building on the left, 3 of them. Weapons up, eyes wide with fear and adrenaline. Thomas engaged before they could fire. 2 rounds center mass on the first, 2 more on the second. The third dove for cover and got a round through the top of his skull before he reached it. Clean kills, professional kills. The kind of shooting that came from 40 years of practice and 10,000 rounds fired in training. No satisfaction in it, no triumph, just the grim efficiency of a man doing a job that needed doing. More guards coming now, the compound waking up. Whatever confusion the generator's destruction had caused was wearing off. Someone had taken charge. Someone was organizing defense. Probably Vincent, leading from his bunker, directing his men through whatever backup communications existed. Thomas pushed forward, Bull and Mike with him, Hutch providing covering fire from behind. The resistance stiffened as they approached the main building. These were not perimeter guards anymore. These were the inner circle. Vincent's most trusted men, the ones who had been with him longest, who had killed for him, who would die for him. They fought with skill and desperation, knowing that failure meant death, knowing that these old Americans had already killed their way through the outer defenses and would kill their way through them too if they could not stop the advance. The firefight in front of the main building was the worst of the night. Sustained exchange, rounds cracking past, impacts on walls and ground, the particular sound of near misses that became familiar after enough time in combat. Bull took a round in the left shoulder. The impact spun him, dropped him to one knee, blood spreading across his tactical vest in a dark stain. He cursed, words that would have made his drill instructor proud. Got back up. His rifle kept firing, despite the arm that was losing strength by the second. Mike was there before Bull hit the ground again. Combat medic instincts overriding everything else. Pressure bandage slapped onto the wound. Morphine auto-injector into the thigh. No time for proper treatment. No time for assessment. Just the rapid application of whatever would keep Bull functional long enough to finish the mission. Bull grinned through the pain. That Marine grin that said pain did not matter. That said he had been hurt worse and kept fighting. That said, as long as his hands worked and his eyes could see, he was still in this fight. They pushed forward. 3 men now instead of 4, leaving Hutch behind to hold the exit, trusting that he would keep it open no matter what came at him. Hutch's leg finally gave out, the pain overwhelming, the damaged muscles failing completely. He went down hard, face in the dirt, rifle still in his hands. He did not stop fighting, could not walk, could still shoot. Positioned himself against a wall and provided covering fire while the others advanced, every round placed with precision. That others may live, even now, even like this. Thomas reached the main building, kicked through the door, entered. Guards inside, close quarters, rifle too long. He transitioned to pistol. 3 shots, 3 down, moving through rooms, clearing corners, searching for the bunker. Bull followed, shoulder bleeding but rifle still up. Mike covered the rear, engaging anyone who tried to flank. The bunker entrance was in the basement, steel door, reinforced, designed to survive bombing. Thomas placed his last charges, shaped around the lock and hinges, stepped back. Triggered detonation. The door blew inward, smoke and dust billowing. Thomas went through, into darkness, into concrete walls and fluorescent lights, into the place where Vincent Kane waited. The bunker was large, designed to be a command center, screens showing camera feeds that were now dark, communications equipment that was now dead, stockpiles of weapons and ammunition for a siege that would never happen. Vincent Kane stood in the center, older than Thomas remembered, the scars from 6 bullets visible on his neck and chest, pale lines against weathered skin, hair gone gray, face lined with 30 years of hatred, but still dangerous. Still the Delta operator who had survived when he should have died. Still the man who had built an empire on betrayal and blood. He was not surprised to see Thomas, had known this was coming, had been waiting for it. They faced each other across the bunker, 65 and 50, Ranger and Delta, teacher and student, enemy and enemy. Vincent spoke first, said he had been waiting 30 years for this, said Thomas had taught him everything he knew, that the men who trained Vincent had learned from Thomas, that every tactic, every technique, every instinct had come originally from the man standing in front of him. Killing Thomas would prove Vincent was the better warrior, would prove that the student had surpassed the master, would be the final victory in a war that started in a jungle clearing 3 decades ago. He explained why he had waited instead of striking first, why he had not simply assassinated Thomas in his home, because Delta operators did not hide in shadows, did not strike from concealment like cowards. They faced their enemies directly, proved superiority through direct combat. That was the warrior code, the code Thomas had taught. Thomas said nothing, just raised his rifle, just aimed. They fired simultaneously, both professionals, both trained, both experienced in the mathematics of killing. Both hit. Thomas felt the impact in his ribs, pain exploding through his chest, blood soaking his vest. But the body armor caught most of the round. Cracked ribs, not penetration, not fatal. Vincent took the round in the shoulder, same shoulder Thomas had hit 30 years ago in Panama, spinning him, staggering him, but not dropping him. Both rifles were empty now. No time to reload, no time for pistols. They closed the distance, hand to hand, close quarters combat at its most primitive. Vincent was younger, stronger, faster, had every physical advantage. But Thomas had something Vincent did not. Purpose beyond ego. Thomas fought for his daughter, for his team, for the Americans who would die if Vincent lived, for a mission that mattered more than personal victory. Vincent fought for revenge, for pride, for proving he was the better man, for 30 years of hatred that had consumed him. Hatred made you rigid, made you predictable, made you care about winning more than surviving. They fought in the dim bunker light, trading blows, grappling, falling and rising and falling again. 2 old warriors giving everything they had. Thomas felt his body failing, age catching up, wounds accumulating, strength draining with every movement. But he did not quit, did not stop, did not give up. His hand found his knife, the blade he had carried for 40 years, the last gift from his father, given the day Thomas graduated Ranger School. He drew, thrust, found flesh, buried the blade in Vincent Kane's chest, twisted. Vincent's eyes went wide, surprise, disbelief, the realization that he had lost, that 30 years of planning and hatred had ended with cold steel in his heart. He tried to speak, could not. Blood filled his mouth. He fell. Thomas stood over him, watching, making sure. This time there would be no mistake, no assumption, no resurrection. Vincent Kane died on the floor of his bunker, surrounded by the empire he had built on betrayal, killed by the man he had sworn to destroy. Thomas keyed his radio, voice rough with pain and exhaustion. It is done. Vincent is dead. Extract. Getting out was harder than getting in. The compound was chaos. Some guards had fled into the desert. Others were still fighting. Fire spreading from the destroyed generator. Smoke filling the air. Confusion everywhere. They fought their way back to Hutch, found him still shooting from his position, still providing cover despite the leg that would not work. They carried him, Bull on one side despite his wounded shoulder, Thomas on the other despite his broken ribs, moving through smoke and gunfire while Mike provided security and Jordan's rifle covered their retreat from the ridge. The extraction helicopter appeared as they cleared the compound. Civilian aircraft, no markings, pilot who asked no questions. They loaded in, lifted off, watched the compound burning below them, watched 30 years of debt being paid in flames. Thomas sat in the helicopter as desert passed beneath him. His team around him, his daughter's voice on the radio, his body broken but alive, his mission complete. Bull would need surgery for the shoulder, would recover, would tell this story for the rest of his life. Mike would return to his parish, would pray for the souls they had taken, would find peace in knowing they had protected the innocent. Hutch would need months of rehabilitation, might never walk right again. But he was sober, was useful, was the man his son had believed in. Jordan would continue her work, protecting Americans who would never know her name, being the ghost in the hills who appeared when hope ran out. They crossed the border as the sun rose, golden light washing over the desert, painting everything in colors of hope and renewal. The helicopter touched down at the ranch as full morning arrived, the same field where Thomas had played as a child, where he had proposed to Rachel under a sky full of stars, where he had taught Jordan to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle. The team climbed out, wounded, exhausted, victorious. Bull's shoulder would need surgery. The round had done more damage than the field bandage suggested, and infection was a risk without proper treatment. But he was already talking about the story he would tell at the gun shop. About the night a bunch of old guys assaulted a cartel fortress and walked away alive. Margaret would complain when she saw him, would tell him he was too old for this nonsense, would cry when she realized how close she had come to becoming a widow. But she would understand, as she had always understood. Some calls you answered no matter what they cost. Mike would return to his parish with new scars and new memories, would pray for the souls of the men they had killed, because every soul deserved prayer even if the body that housed it had done terrible things, would find peace in knowing that the violence he had committed had protected the innocent, that the blood on his hands was the price of keeping other hands clean. His congregation would never know, would see only the gentle priest who heard their confessions and blessed their children and presided over their funerals, would never suspect that the man in the collar had spent a night in Mexico killing cartel soldiers and ending a traitor's 30-year reign of terror. That was how it should be. The flock did not need to know what the shepherd did to protect them, did not need to carry that weight. That was the shepherd's burden, freely accepted. Hutch would need months of rehabilitation. The leg that had barely functioned before the mission had been damaged further by the long hike and the combat that followed. He might never walk without a limp again, might need a cane for the rest of his life. But he had proven something to himself that was more important than mobility, had proven that the man his son believed in still existed, had proven that the motto he had lived by was not just words but identity, had saved lives through his actions, through his planning, through his refusal to quit even when his body begged him to stop, that others may live. David would have been proud. Hutch could finally believe that, could finally start to forgive himself for not being able to save his son, could finally begin the healing that he had been avoiding for 3 years. He was still sober. 61 days now. The craving was still there, would probably always be there, but it was manageable. The mission had given him something stronger than alcohol, had given him purpose and meaning, and the knowledge that he still mattered. Jordan would continue her work. The cartels had not been destroyed, only disrupted. Vincent Kane was dead, but others would rise to take his place. The border would remain violent, remain dangerous, remain a place where Americans needed protection that official channels could not provide. She would be that protection, would remain Wraith, would continue appearing when hope ran out and disappearing before questions could be asked, would save lives that would never know her name and ask for nothing in return except the knowledge that she had made a difference. Thomas had given her that, had trained her and shaped her and created the warrior she had become. Whatever happened to him, whatever the future held, his legacy would continue through her. Thomas stood on his land and looked at the valley that had been home for his entire life. The fence post still leaned at its crooked angle. 3 weeks of neglect that would have driven his father crazy. The ranch needed work, needed attention, needed the care that 3 generations of Grants had given it. But the ranch could wait, had waited this long, would wait a little longer. Right now, there was coffee to drink and wounds to tend and stories to tell. There was a daughter to hug and brothers to thank and a life to resume now that the mission was complete. Jordan walked across the field to stand beside him. The morning sun caught her hair, turning it golden at the edges. She looked tired but satisfied. The way operators looked when a mission went well. The way Thomas had looked 1,000 times after coming home from work that no one else would ever know about. She said nothing for a long moment, just stood beside her father and watched the sun climb higher over the mountains that had watched over this valley since before humans existed. Then she thanked him for teaching her, for trusting her, for being the father she needed even when she did not know she needed him, for showing her what duty and honor and sacrifice actually meant instead of just talking about them. Thomas looked at his daughter and saw everything he had hoped she would become, more than a warrior, more than an operator, a complete person who understood that violence was a tool, not an identity, who could kill when killing was necessary and then set down the killing and be human again. Rachel would have been proud, would have been terrified too, probably, at the danger Jordan placed herself in, but proud underneath the fear, proud that their daughter had become someone who made a difference, someone who protected the innocent, someone who stood up when others sat down. Thomas told Jordan he was proud, told her that whatever came next, she would face it with skills and values that would never fail her. Told her that the best thing he had ever done was not the missions or the training or the medals. The best thing he had ever done was raise her. Jordan hugged him, fierce and brief, the hug of soldiers who did not have time for extended emotion. Then she went inside to start the coffee. Bull and Mike and Hutch were loading into Bull's truck. They would drive to the hospital in San Diego where Bull's shoulder would be treated and Hutch's leg would be examined, and Mike would watch over both of them with the protective instincts of a combat medic who never stopped being responsible for his team. They would heal, would recover, would return to their lives with new stories and new scars, but they would remain brothers, would remain team, would remain the family that service had created and time could not destroy. Thomas watched them drive away, watched the dust settle behind the truck, watched the morning light spread across the valley. He had led the way one final time, had completed one final mission, had proven that old warriors could still fight, could still win, could still matter in a world that had mostly forgotten they existed. The fence post still needed fixing, would get fixed eventually, would stand straight again because Thomas would make it straight the way his father had taught him, the way 3 generations of Grants had maintained this land. But not today. Today was for rest, for healing, for being with family and appreciating the simple fact of still being alive when so many were not. Thomas Grant walked toward the house, toward the porch Rachel had loved, toward the coffee mug she had given him that he still used every morning because using it kept her close, toward the life he had earned through 40 years of service and one last act of violence. The desert stretched around him, beautiful and deadly, the land that had shaped him and his father and his grandfather before that, the land that would shape his daughter and whatever children she might have someday. The last ranger was finally at peace. He stood on the porch as the morning sun climbed higher, warming his face and easing some of the aches that had accumulated over the long night. The valley spread before him in all its harsh beauty, the same view that had greeted Grants for 3 generations, the same mountains, the same desert floor, the same endless sky that made you feel small and significant at the same time. Jordan came out with 2 mugs of coffee, handed one to her father, stood beside him looking at the land they both loved. Neither spoke for a long time. There was nothing that needed saying. The mission was complete. Vincent Kane was dead. The threat that had brought them together was eliminated. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Eventually, Jordan asked what he would do now, whether he would go back to fixing fences and watching sunsets, whether the peace he had earned would be enough. Thomas considered the question, thought about the years ahead, thought about the body that was worn but not broken, the mind that was sharp but tired, the spirit that had found purpose again after years of merely existing. He told her he would fix the fence post, would get the ranch back in order, would spend time with the brothers who had fought beside him, would be here for his daughter whenever she needed him. But he also knew that peace was temporary, that violence was always waiting somewhere, that men like him were never truly done, just resting between missions. If another call came, if another threat emerged, if Americans needed protection that official channels could not provide, he would answer. That was what Rangers did. That was what soldiers did. That was what men did who had sworn oaths and meant them. Jordan nodded. She understood, had inherited that same sense of duty, would carry it forward when he was gone. The sun continued to rise. The day continued to unfold. Life continued in the quiet valley where 3 generations of Grants had built their legacy. Thomas Grant drank his coffee and watched the desert and felt something he had not felt in years. Not just peace, not just satisfaction. Hope. The end.